This episode is brought to you by Communications Training for Coffee Teams, a new Map It Forward workshop tailored to get your team communicating more confidently to improve general mental health as well as business profitability. Click the link in the show notes for further details. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and today we have a very, very special treat. This is probably the podcast that I have from the beginning of this podcast. This is the podcast that I have been looking forward to doing the most. It is my absolute honor and pleasure to welcome George Howell to the podcast. George, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Lee. And thank you for having me on.
It is really my pleasure, sir. You are somebody who has mentored an industry, and I don't say that lightly. You are the original pioneer of setting the standards of everything that we learn from and we take from and we aspire to. And before we kick all of this off, I just want to say how grateful I am that you started all of this. And, we'll go through a whole bunch of the stuff that you've done. And we're not going to do a detailed history. There's plenty of stuff on the internet. We're not going to waste George's time by doing a detailed history, but we are going to do a series that we've never titled a series like this before. But the theme of this series is the industry according to George Howell. And we're going to follow some pretty interesting things through this series. But today, we're going to talk about prioritizing the coffee producer. So, George, very, very quickly, tell people who you are, and then we'll get on to our subject.
Well, I've been involved in coffee since 1975, right? So close to 50 years now. And I really started it from a 100% aesthetic direction, completely.
Wow.
I was involved before that studying the history of art. I dabbled in art myself. I loved everything from ancient art around the world to modern art, from classical music to avant-garde jazz. It was the early 60s. It was the days of Coltrane and so on.
Nice.
And I spent perhaps more time in the weekends at listening to jazz and so on than going to my Yale classes at the time. So, and then in 74, I was leaving California and involved in exhibiting this, what I felt was absolutely extraordinary indigenous art from Mexico, 5 specific artists. So one of the themes that I'm really pushing now with farmers really started there in a way, because here I was in 1972 to 75, spending all my time exhibiting this art of these artists from Mexico who were doing these so-called yarn paintings, much like the Australian original paintings, right? But
beautiful
with much more
work.
color and using a wool yarn, bright colored wool yarn, purchased, right? Pressed into beeswax, making these figures, mythological stories completely. But these artists and many craftspeople who were making copies of the original pieces that they were doing were treated like garbage, right? They were folk artists, the definition of folk artists, the real definition, which is, it's cute, it belongs in my kid's room. It's not really for adults. I mean, that's the way, right? Or it's not indigenous enough because it's not two-dimensional enough, and on and on and on. Anyway, it's a whole several years of intense some reception in California, and moved east to really resume my studies. But with the third kid on the way, and exhibiting the art, which I was in love with, and again, wanting to present it as modern art by a modern artist who deserves the credit that any Western artist would get, right? And totally original works, and in evolution, not fixed and frozen in time. like so many arts from the past. So I came back east drinking my favorite coffee at the time, and got to Boston, where a friend was, and realized that the coffee there in Boston was disastrous. I mean, I hated it, and I had already become hooked on really good tasting coffee, making a French press, grinding and making a French press already. Not liking the super dark roasts that I encountered on the West Coast, but there were also light roasts, which I found. So already I was hooked into that lighter roast flavor, right? It was much less bitter to me and sweeter and rounder. And so encountering, especially on the East Coast, much more traditional, fixated sense of art and so on, and encountering professors at Harvard and Yale who love the art, but not the people who ran institutions, interestingly enough. And couldn't really get through. Had a few exhibits, but really was getting nowhere with it. And at the same time, realizing that I couldn't get decent coffee anywhere. And so Lori, my wife, and I kind of figured out this was the moment to do a cafe. All right. So we started that way, and realized, well, we thought that it was a matter of the coffee being incredibly stale.
Okay.
Because that's what it was. It was so stale, you couldn't tell how bad it was. Right. It was that bad.
Oh, yeah.
And so, we let our fingers do the walking through the yellow pages at that time, and found one single, quote, gourmet roaster in the area for wholesale. He came to our apartment at that time with 3 bags of green coffee. One was Brazil, one was Central American, the other, I believe, was Colombian. And he said, hey, you want Jamaican Blue Mountain? I'll blend it this way. You want something else? I'll blend it another way.
Wow.
They're pretty much all the same. And so here you go, right? So that's when we realized that we had to roast ourselves.
And source? Did you realize at that point that you needed to source your own coffee as well?
Well, yeah, we knew we needed to find importers.
Okay.
Right. There was no idea yet of sourcing yourself. There was, who can sell me green coffee and guarantee to me that that's the real source, right? So we started looking really on the West Coast. We had friends there and so on, and that's where specialty was starting. Pete's had opened up in the 60s already. Starbucks had opened up in 71. Not the Howard Schultz Starbucks, but the Jerry Baldwin Starbucks, right? And the coffee house would allow us also to put the art up on the walls,
right?
At the same time.
That's the merging cafe, of the passions.
Yeah, and it was right there in Harvard Square, and Harvard University surrounds Harvard Square, right? So we opened up. Rent was cheap in those days, etc. So we opened up. That art would really capture the attention of a lot of students, art students, and so on at Harvard. It led to real work being done in Mexico City and in Mexico, both in terms of funding for projects for the Huixárika, as they're called, deep in the mountains, and also it led. We were a major factor in enabling finally the exhibit of these 5 artists in Mexico City in the Museum of Modern Art.
Wow.
Of modern art, right? Amazing.
Wow.
And but in the meanwhile, when we opened up this cafe, that became the business too. And
it sounds like there's a real correlation between the underappreciation of those artists and your passion for the underappreciation of producers.
Yes, the producers, it's really craftsmen who are driven by the craft to do something, regardless of what they get paid.
And in the conversations that you and I have had, there's this clear passion that you have for getting the industry and consumers to start prioritizing producers. It's something that has been pushed for forever by our industry. And I don't understand why we can't seem to convert. Why can't we have this failure to launch every time? I see.
Well, it wasn't until 2000, I think, that the farmer started to become the focal point. Really.
But do you think they're the focal point yet?
Sorry?
Do you think that we've arrived there? Like,
no, because we're constantly going into detours, one detour after another. I mean, it's always been a major uphill battle. I mean, I don't know about Australia and elsewhere, but at the States, I think you're an optimist if you think 15% of the American consumers drink black coffee.
Well, yeah.
So if you're adding milk in your coffee, which I can enjoy on my drive through, God knows where there's no decent real coffee. And I can stop at a mildly darker roast, whatever, cappuccino, but I'll be adding milk to it, for the caffeine, for the hit, and it can make a fairly decent cappuccino. So, but black coffee is the only thing that really enables a farmer to stand out for what they do.
Where is the line between how much the consumer should care about the producer and how much of the responsibility they place or the onus that they give to the cafe to be the custodian of taking care of all of these problems?
Yeah. It's, to me, consumers have got to love the drink. It has to come before everything else, political, social, anything.
Right.
Because if they don't love the drink, they ain't going to do it.
Do
they will find other causes equally valid, equally important, deserving of their energy and money. Right. So it really has to be just like in the wine industry. The great wines survive because people really love to drink it and love to talk about it and get into it. Right. And that happens, but not anywhere near enough in coffee. Right.
Do we give up the push? Because you're talking about we need consumers, if we want them to adopt this idea of what's going on in the supply chain. And there are a multitude of things going on in the supply chain that if the consumer knew about what was going on, they most likely would change the way that they look at coffee. Do we have to put some? But that's going to become increasingly more of a sum as we look at things like the energy crisis and we look at things like the shift in climate change. We look at economics and the very real issues that producers are going to be faced with that are going to make them have to make some hard decisions.
But take the 1980s and 1990s, right? Okay. Fair trade was the big thing then.
Right.
Right? I couldn't sell fair trade. I think I sold fair trade coffees once or twice, and I was happy to do so because it tasted good. But the vast majority of both organic and fair trade coffees did not compare in quality.
No.
They just didn't. So the theme wasn't the issue. It was the coffee itself, which I could not get behind. Right?
Right.
And then we saw in Peru, back in the, I think it was 90s, more or less, that, farmers there in quantity were all converted to organic. And so, but not the quality story. And in fact, the quality may have even dropped.
Right.
Because it was in pursuit of the money for the organic and so on, which went nowhere. Right. So the themes are not as powerful as drink it and go, wow. Right.
Was the beginning of Cup of Excellence, was that a big effort to try and get the industry to prioritize the producer?
Yeah, that was very interesting. That was a very fun moment in my life, really.
Really?
Yeah, those years, I have to say. I had retired. I'd sold my company, Coffee Connection, to Starbucks. And then I was invited by Marcelo Vieira, who became head of the Brazilian Specialty Coffee Association later on, to be the quality consultant to the Gourmet Project, which was a project really set up by the National Coffee the International Coffee Organization.
The ICO?
Yes, in Britain at the time, in London, and the United Nations, right? And so I went to Brazil. I was there several times over the next 2.5 years, 2-3 weeks at a time, in this vast country. 40% of the world's supply is in Brazil. And visiting farm after farm after farm, often into the night, really cupping Brazils, which I had always looked down on.
Okay.
As being a commercial coffee, end of story, period.
Right.
All right. And so I was being sensitized to that there was far more than what I thought it was. Right.
Right.
And, the coffee could be actually quite good. Right. Especially if you had a coffee, say, that Ernesto Ely from Ely Cafe was buying.
Right.
And tasting that, and then cupping with people and being challenged here and there to, well, here are the 5 coffees that I'm cupping right now, and one of them won the Ely Prize. Tell me which one, right? And I was lucky. I got him right, but and I not. Who knows?
It would have been a sliding doors moment. We don't know which direction you would have gone after that.
100%. That's happened more than once. That way.
I love that.
Key moments, right?
Yeah.
Where your heart's in your throat for a moment.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're dealing with people who really know what they're talking about and what they're tasting, and have been doing it far longer than you have, at least back then. Right? But also then going to the coffee fairs, because with such a vast production, you had fairs in all these different regions happening at different times, where farmers gathered together, did presentations and so on. And I was giving a presentation on why it was necessary for Brazil to improve their quality, and what an opportunity it was to sell to the United States, which had this growing specialty coffee movement and so on, and that they could get higher prices. And what did that take? Right. So that was my lecture. So I had this, I was doing really into PowerPoint at that point. And I had this person on the ground holding a kite, right? And the kite itself was the price of coffee, or the coffee itself, right? And I had marketing, and mainly marketing would be definitely, and different political themes are like winds that raise the kite. But if the quality, the person down below holding the kite let go, the kite will take off and the price will rise, but then the kite crashes.
Right.
Straight to the ground, right?
Right.
So that was the opening theme right there with that. But in any case, at the end of 2.5 years, I developed 2 programs. One, which was really exciting, which was, and of course, a lot of the farmers really did have a lot of money, and they were very large, almost all of them. They started generally, a small farm was 10 hectares.
Wow. So, and they were selling commercial coffee.
Yeah. But really, those did not have the kind of money, right? So they were cherries, naturals that were just green and red and everything in between, really low quality, right? But there were others who really had estates, huge estates, whatever. And they were often opening up new farms, whatever. And so we found several who were willing to participate, who started at the lowest level. And then the point was that each year they would introduce a quality improvement.
Wow.
Right. And so they would have to borrow the money for that through a bank. And we'd follow the profit and loss. And did that farm become more profitable or less the more it invested in quality, machinery, technology, and so on to do this, right? That started, but it only went 2 years, because when Cup of Excellence happened and the project ended, that maybe went, and just died off, right? But it was
that would
really
be a very exciting study to do right now.
Yeah, step by step. I've always believed you don't start large if you haven't started small and created small models and see how they work, right? And very gradually grow it to really make sure that your model works, and on several levels as well, right? So, but again, that part got left off. The second piece that I came up with was towards the end, and it was thanks to an awful lot of people, who helped me along the way, encouraged me, and so on. One was David Griswold, who ran Sustainable Coffee, a Harvest.
Sustainable Harvest, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And at a point of real discouragement, when the first year at the end, I sent 3 samples of coffees to roasters and importers across the states, the biggest names, right? And beginners and so on. And really got 2 responses. Either I didn't get around to it, I'm too busy, sorry, or it's 25, it's better than my Brazil, but it's not 25 cents better.
Right.
That was, I can't tell you how many times that just still rings in my ears.
Yeah.
And, I complained to David about that, and he invited me to California. And he said he would gather a bunch of roasters together to meet, and we would all cup these coffees of mine, these 3 samples that I had gathered. One of them being the #1 prize winner of Ernesto Ili's competition.
Okay.
Right. I got like 20 kilos of it.
Yep.
Right. As a sample. And there I had it. Right. And I said, that's great. And so, but I wanted each of the roasters who were coming to also have their Brazil participate.
Okay.
Right. So we would cup mine and theirs simultaneously. Right. And I made sure all the roasts were evenly done, light roasted and so on, prepared properly. And we put it out there, right? And we had a number of really key people there from the SCA and others. And the 3 coffees that I had took first, second, and third place.
Beautiful.
We did this twice. The other person who did one like that for me, with also another 11 roasters, was John Gosbeckia, who's been throughout the industry, who used to work for me back in the early 70s as a kid. But
I
he
suspect
did another
you
one,
birthed
and we
a lot
did
of
the same
them.
thing. So,
and was it born from there? Was the competition born from there?
It was born. That was part of it.
Okay.
And what was really amazing was how people it starts when you're starting with the cupping and everything else. We're all business people.
Right.
Doing
business things
we're paid to do. And it's business. At the end, when they're and they find the results, and we're spending like 40 minutes, 45, even an hour cupping this thing over and over and so on, right? At the end, when the 3 coffees come up and they're the best, there was an enthusiasm that hadn't been there before. And people were more, like college kids or people having fun.
It's again, it goes back to that creative, artistic moment when business turns into creativity, right?
Yeah, it's that whole contagious thing, right?
They're the moments in business that you remember as the most beautiful times.
It was great. Absolutely great. So, and that was a time where a key person then was Martin Diedrich.
Oh, wow.
Right. And he was one of the people there, and he became a real fan. He came to the first Cup of Excellence.
Wow.
He participated and going through. The other big influence was earlier than that, and that was when I first went to Kenya, and met Jeremy Block, who had purchased Dorman's coffee.
Oh, okay.
And was really a revolutionary.
That little company.
A real revolutionary with coffee.
Yeah, wow.
No doubt about it. And that's when I had Coffee Connection. And he proposed to me that we do a competition. Right?
Is that where it was born?
Coffee Connection competition. Sorry?
Wow. Is that where the idea was born?
Well, certainly it was in my head. All these things are there. Wow. You know, nothing's created from nothing.
No.
It's influences and other people before you build on what people give you. And many of us don't see those opportunities and those gifts that are given to do something beyond it or build on it.
That's right? A beautiful line. You build on what people give you. Yeah. I mean, if more entrepreneurs and more people in coffee understood that, we'd stop reinventing the wheel.
Right. Yes.
We really would stop reinventing the wheel.
Well, I think that's the most exciting thing. And so, and the other, so it was the competition that he did, right? And so we were buying like 12 lots at that time with Coffee Connection. I was in love with Kenya coffee. And I had gone from just betting double A's and ABs. No, it was always just Kenya double A's. And I was starting to ask in the mid 80s, well, isn't there something beyond? What about a farm or something? You know, can I get, and Erna Knudsen, who was the right? She took me to Africa and said, work with Jeremy. I'll just take a small break, small cut. And you guys can talk together.
Beautiful.
I mean, that's a gift.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's amazing. And so, you know, the other thing about Kenya that was so special, and I learned that earlier through an earlier visit, was the fact that those times the law had it that all coffee had to be sold through the auction. Oh. Right. I mean, you could all
for transparency.
Lots, it was completely, from that point, from a buyer's point of view, it was completely transparent. Not so for farmers, right?
Right.
But
the
buyers,
auction was transparency, right?
Right. So I would get these lots of 40 to 80 bags. They were bigger back then, 40 to 80 bags sampling. He would send it to me a week before, literally FedEx or however you did it back then.
You'd fax the paperwork over.
The coffee samples.
and the coffee samples turned up first.
So it was in the late 80s that I really learned to cup, right?
Right.
Not before then. And
wow.
So that was a whole other fun novelty, right? That we really, and I learned that in Costa Rica through La Minita and Bill McAlpin, and through Kenya with Dorman's, right?
Wow.
The cupping. So we would cup all these different lines. He would send me lots of different samples, the best ones that he had found. And I would cup through it and pick this one and that one. And then at the end, so it'd be typically 12 lots. And then we did a competition for the best ones, right? And there were prizes given. I'm sorry, but then back to the auction. The auction meant that I could compete with any buyer in the world for whatever lot I wanted. I was on an equal footing.
Which was great for you.
Do that?
Yeah.
Nowhere. So he would say, okay, you really like this coffee. What do you want to pay for it? And I always said, and because I was the first one, I was very lucky because I didn't get killed with this one. I said, sky's the limit.
Oh, wow.
All the costs, sky's the limit. So we literally, for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, right, in the late 80s into the early 90s, we paid the highest prices for the Kenya coffees.
What does that look like in those days?
As I recall, right, it was somewhere $4 or $5 a pound.
Oh, my Lord.
Which was very high for those days. Right?
Very high for those days, right?
Yeah.
But it just gives people who are listening an understanding of what very high for those days was then versus the $1,000 a pound that's getting paid today.
Yeah, but that's
I mean, it's apples and oranges. Right. Yeah. But it's still
which I call oligarch coffee.
Oh, I like that term. And you know what? What a perfect place to end this episode as we go into the next conversation. And folks, in the next episode, you want to tune in for this. Excuse me. George is going to talk about trends in the coffee industry, and you don't want to miss this. So join us for the next episode. Thank you, George. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in, friends. There are 2 ways you can support this podcast. Firstly, become a paid member of our YouTube channel. Secondly, you can join our Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video before you leave, and check the show notes for more information. Now, this is what you should check out next.